Welcome, everyone. Welcome in. This class is the fourth class out of 6 of this year. We are slaves. Next year, we'll be free with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you. It's good to see everybody. Welcome. We are beginning our fourth class in our series on This Year We Are Slaves, Next Year We'll Be Free. And we've been doing close readings of the Exodus story, Yetziat Mitzrayim, but we've also been focusing on some broader philosophical questions of liberation, emancipation. What does it mean to be free? How does one become free when one has been existing in a state of enslavement? And as I mentioned in the very first class, if there's ever a text that serves as a cornerstone for Western thought on the question of freedom and the question of emancipation, it is the Exodus. It has inspired, as Hannah Arendt said, the thinkers that we think of, the secular thinkers that we think of as being the philosophers or the great activists for freedom. They themselves were often inspired by the Torah, by the Bible, and particularly by this story. In our first session, we looked at Pharaoh's racist fantasy and how that leads to the enslavement of the Jews. In the second session, we looked at Moshe in his almost irrational, insane pursuit of justice and the consequences of that. And last session, we looked at Pharaoh's intransigence, that even when he is presented with miracles, even when he is presented with God, God's name, God's desires, Paro cannot recognize it, right? God and Paro exists essentially to deny the possibility of God, right? To deny the possibility of an idea that threatens the very foundations of Egypt. What we're going to look at today is hopefully a topic that is a little bit of a different angle on the concept of the Exodus. And we're going to look at what is it that the Jewish people do themselves that helps make them free, that emancipates them. If we're familiar with the story, we know the primary driver of the liberation from Egypt is Moshe, right? Moshe is the active party. Moshe is the one going to Paro. Moshe is the one making the demands to Paro. Moshe is the one bringing miracles to basically get the Jewish people out of Egypt, right? Moshe is the one who says the famous words, Shalach et ami, right? Let my people go, v'yavduni, so that they can worship their God. The question is, are the Jews themselves doing anything to earn their freedom? Is it important that the Jews themselves do anything to earn their freedom? So the short answer is yes, right? That I think we all know that somebody else can remove your chains, but true freedom is something that on some level we have to earn for ourselves. And that's the idea that we're going to explore today. What is it that the Jews do to earn their freedom? Or what is it that the rabbis at least want to imagine the Jews did do to be able to earn their freedom? And in many ways, this question is deeply relevant to the things in our own lives, in our own societies that enslave us, sometimes in ways that we don't even fully recognize. So to do this, let me load up the 1 second. 20 minutes. Good. So to set up the question that we're going to look at is, what do the Jews have to do to make themselves free? We're actually going to start by looking at the great German philosopher Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the great German idealists. Right, there's 4 great German idealists, if you have any familiarity or any interest in German philosophy: Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling. Hegel is one of the great philosophers of freedom, particularly in the modern era. Hegel, and we'll see a little bit of Kant tonight as well, but Hegel and Kant, really all of the German philosophers at that time, are greatly inspired by the French Revolution. French Revolution takes Europe by storm, right? It doesn't just transform France, it presents the possibility of revolution, of freedom for all of Europe. And many people are influenced by it and very much captured by its ethos, right? Fraternité, solidarité, égalité, right? Solidarity, freedom, and equality, right? Those are the foundation principles of the French Revolution. In many ways, those are the foundational principles of our modern world. Hegel is very much inspired by that. And as I mentioned before, right, the Exodus is a text that if you're going to write about freedom, if you're going to think about freedom, you're going to have to look at. Part of what makes the German philosophers interesting at this time, this is basically the beginning of the 19th century, is that they are often trying to grapple with both philosophy and religion, right? They're not just looking at one to the exclusion of the other. They're actually often trying to grapple and hold together both. And in Hegel's Philosophizing on Freedom, this is one of his earlier essays, he draws on a lot of religious and theological issues and questions. And in it, as he's exploring the idea of freedom, he turns to the Exodus. Now, as I said, for many Western thinkers, the Exodus is a great model of freedom, right? A great model of emancipation. Hegel is not so enthused with the Exodus story. Hegel actually finds it kind of problematic as a story of emancipation, and we'll see why in just a moment. I mean, the simple reason I'll just point out, why does Hegel not like the Exodus as a story of emancipation? Because unlike maybe the sort of praise I've been trying to heap upon the Exodus story, if you're actually familiar with the rest of the Torah, if you're familiar with the rest of the book of Exodus, you realize that you can take the Jews out of Egypt, but it's not so easy to take the slavery out of the Jews. So if you're going to tell me the Exodus is this great emancipation, this great story of freedom, then why is it 5 minutes after leaving Egypt, the Jews are telling Moshe they want to go back, right? Doesn't seem like a whole lot was accomplished by this elaborate, Exodus story. If again, the first moment the Jews find something challenging, or the first moment they kind of get fed up in the desert, that they want to run back, right? If anything, you could argue the Exodus story is about the failures of emancipation. Because what do we know? We know that the generation which leaves Egypt, right, the generation that was born into slavery, does that generation make it to freedom in the promised land? Right? They don't. They die in the desert and they're buried in unmarked graves. Right? So in many ways, this, as I've been saying, the Exodus is a story of freedom, but it portrays freedom in all of its complexities and all of its difficulties. Not so easy to achieve. Right? Striking down your masters is not the automatic guarantee that you will be free. Leaving the place that enslaved you is not the automatic guarantee that you will be free. And Hegel is very, very sensitive to that. And the detail that we're going to see here that Hegel keeps picking up on, that really bothers Hegel for good reason, is that the Jews don't seem to do a lot in Egypt to earn their freedom. They just don't, they don't even seem to care so much about the whole Exodus as it's taking place in the midst of Egypt. Right? There's a famous moment where Moshe turns to them after the Exodus is already starting, and the Torah says that they just can't even hear Moshe because of how bad things are, right? Mekotzer ruach, right? So it's not like, in a classic movie about revolution in which the leader rallies the people behind, great acts of, courage and heroism. There isn't a lot of courage and heroism from the Jews in Egypt that we can obviously see. We'll see it's a little bit more complicated than that, but on the surface level, there's not a lot there. So here's what Hegel says. He says, when Moses, an isolated enthusiast for the liberation of his people, came to the elders of the Israelites and spoke to them as a project. Basically, Hegel's reviewing the details of the Exodus. And he's noting Moshe comes first to tell the people of God's plan, right? God is calling. God is telling them it's time to be free. He spoke to them of his project, his divine calling found its legitimation, not in a heartfelt hatred of oppression, not in a longing for air and freedom, but in certain tricks with which Moses baffled them, and which were performed subsequently with equal skill by the Egyptian conjurers. Right? If you remember at the burning bush, Moshe has a concern if he's going to go to the Jews. Moshe says to God, what if I go and they don't believe me? How am I going to get them to rally behind me? And what does God offer to Moshe? He says to Moshe, I'm going to give you miracles that you can perform for the Jews, and that'll be the way they know that you're the real deal. Now, in the context of the story, we're not maybe so bothered by that. But if you think about, again, emancipation, about liberation, revolution, it's a little strange. Because what you would think is when Moshe arrives to tell the people that he is going to lead them as God's emissary out of the Exodus, you would think that the people want to be free. The people have been suffering for so long, right? You would think this is the moment when there's finally an opportunity to fight for their freedom, right? There's going to be people that are going to rise up and say, okay, Moshe, we're behind you. But that's not the way the story works, right? The only way Moshe is able to convince the Jews that they should get behind him, they should, start the process of leaving Egypt, is because Moshe can do miracles for them. And Hegel's point is, if you have to convince people to get behind you by doing miracles, that it doesn't seem that those people are so interested in the mission or vision that you have. And I think there's a certain truth to that. Most stories of emancipation or liberation are grounded in the sense of oppression that people are feeling and the hope that they experience of the possibility that things could be different. And that's not the way the Jews seem to be functioning here. Hegel continues. He says, the deeds of Moses and Aaron worked on their brethren precisely as they did on the Egyptians, as a force. And we see how the later defended themselves against subjection by just the same means. What Hegel means, by the way, first off, the miracles that Moshe does for the people to convince them, Hegel already notes, there's not even something so special about them, because the Egyptians can do them too, right? So whatever magic tricks Moshe is doing, they're not even that great. More importantly, what Hegel is noting is that essentially the Jews are only following Moshe to the degree that they can see whether his power, whether God's power is greater than Pharaoh's, right? It's not so much the Jews want to be free, the Jews want to just back the person that is the most powerful, right? And that alone, again, sort of hints to us that perhaps, again, they're not so interested in this freedom thing, right? If they have to see God do all the plagues and defeat Pharaoh before they're willing to leave, then again, what does that say about their desire for freedom? It seems like they're only willing to follow God because God has shown he's more powerful than Pharaoh. Again, that's not so much about pursuit of freedom. Hegel continues, he says, the increased hardships consequent upon Moses' discourse in Pharaoh's presence did not act as a stronger stimulus to the Jews, but only intensified their sufferings. No matter how much Moshe is going to Pharaoh fighting for them, the people don't seem to be, so excited about it. Right? There's a famous moment at the beginning. Moshe goes to Pharaoh. He demands to let the Jewish people go worship God. Pharaoh refuses. Pharaoh not only refuses, Pharaoh makes things worse for the Jews. And the Jews turn around and instead of saying to Moshe, you know what? We know it's rough right now, but we have faith. We believe in you, Moshe. It's going to get better. That's not what the Jews do, right? When things get worse, what do the Jews do? They do what the Jews always do. I was a rabbi, for sure, for a long time. When things get bad, they turn to the leader and they say it's your fault, right? Again, the emphasis here is that they're not necessarily desiring their freedom or working for it. Hegel continues. He says, against no one were the Jews more enraged than against Moshe, whom they cursed. Moses alone takes action. When you look at the whole story, it's Moses, Moses, Moses. Right? That's why the Haggadah is kind of a strange book, because who's famously absent from the Haggadah? Right? Moses. Right? But if you look at the story, it's all Moses, beginning to end. The Jews, again, they're passive. They're barely in there. Permission to depart he extorts because of the king's fear. The Jewish faith does not even allow the king to forget his fear of his own accord and rue the decision extorted from him. Which Hegel's point, now Hegel's being a little bit, you might say, anti-Semitic to a certain extent. He does play with certain anti-Semitic stereotypes here, as we'll see. But his point is that the Torah doesn't even allow Paro to say no to God out of Paro's own stubbornness. Right? Why is it ultimately that Paro says no to God? It's not because Paro is willing to stand up and defy God. Right? Ultimately, it's because God hardens Paro's heart. Right? So even that act of courage and defiance and stubbornness that Paro does, that you could say reflects Paro's own heroism in a certain sense, maybe a twisted heroism, but still heroism, right? The Torah takes that away from him, right? It doesn't even let Paro be free, because even when Paro is freely rejecting God, it's really God's own doing, right? And then Hegel continues, he says, for the Jews, a great thing was done, but they did not inaugurate it with heroic deeds of their own. It is for them that Egypt suffers the most diverse plagues and misery. Amid general lamentation, they withdraw, driven forth by the hapless Egyptians. Right? The Jews don't seem to be doing anything to earn their freedom. They're not taking any, heroic or courageous action. Even more so, again, Hegel's a very close reader of the biblical text. There's actually a verse which he cites here where it says not so much that the Jews left Egypt, but the verse literally reads that like the Egyptians pushed the Jews out of Egypt. Right? It's as if the Jews so didn't want their freedom that they had to literally be thrown out the door. Right? That's the way the Torah almost reads. He says, but they themselves have only malice that cowards feel when his enemy is brought low by someone else's act. Right? What is it the Jews never do? They never fight the Egyptians. They never strike down the Egyptians. Right? It's all God, God, God taking care of everything for them. Right? The Jews in the Exodus story are kind of like children, right? Like Abba, Daddy, taking care of everything. He continues, he says, the Jews vanquished, but they have not battled, right? They didn't earn this. The Egyptians are conquered, but not by their enemies, right? It's God. It's not the Jews doing it. They are conquered like men murdered in their sleep or poisoned by an invisible attack, right? That's what the plagues are, right? Again, it's just a power greater than them coming out of nowhere, just taking out the Egyptians, not the Jews. And the Israelites, with the sign on their houses and the profit which all this misery brings look like the notorious robbers during the plague at Marseille, right? There was an incident in France in which there was a plague. People were suffering, people were dying, but there were a few who like ran into like, I don't remember where they ran into, but they were able to steal while people were suffering from the plague. And that is Hegel's point about the Jews. They leave Egypt, they leave with great wealth, but it's not like they earned it. It's not like they fought for it, right? They kind of snuck in and took it when nobody was looking because they couldn't. And he even knows here, I mean, I won't even read this, but the language that Moshe uses when he tells the Jews to receive sort of wealth from the Egyptians, the language in Hebrew is like shoel, like to borrow, like go ask them. But it could also be read as like go borrow it from them. And what Hegel notes here, it says if the Jews, they're not actually, like this is their moment of triumph. They're about to leave Egypt. They don't need to, what are they asking permission from the Egyptians to take the wealth, right? The Jews earned it, right? They were slaves for hundreds of years. They don't need the Egyptians' permission. They should go into those Egyptians' houses and take it. But what do the Jews do? It's like they like go to their Egyptian neighbor and they say, can we borrow your gold and silver, right? The Jews don't even have the courage just to say, we're taking it, giving it to us, right? And for Hegel, what he sees in the Jews' behavior throughout the Exodus story is a group of slaves that are acting like slaves, right? Beginning, middle, and end. Right, I'll just read the last line here. He said, "It's no wonder that this nation, which in its emancipation bore the most slave-like demeanor, regretted leaving Egypt, wished to return there again whenever difficulty or danger came upon it in the sequel, and thus showed how in its liberation it had been without the soul and the spontaneous need of freedom." Jews never earned their freedom, never desired their freedom. They are, as I said, slaves beginning, middle, and end. That's why when things get tough, they're still slaves. They want to go back to Egypt. Now, there is a way in which some of this plays off, classic Jewish stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes. But I want to note that every point Hegel makes here is within the text, right? He is not making a point where he has to stretch the meaning of the text at all, right? He is very much doing what like a good rabbi does. He's reading the text closely. And when you read the text closely, you notice things. You notice things that you may not have seen before, and they may paint a different picture of the narrative than what you had previously thought. And in truth, all of Hegel's critiques here are to a certain extent echoed by Jewish interpretation, Jewish biblical interpretation as well. I'll just give you, this is one of the classic examples. Ibn Ezra, right? There's a particular moment, you might say is the climax of the story. After the 10 plagues, after the Jews leave Egypt, right? They travel, they find themselves at the Red Sea. And when they arrive at the Red Sea, they have also come to realize that they are being pursued by Pharaoh's army, right? Pharaoh has left Egypt. He's mounted up his horses, his chariots. He wants his slaves back. And there's a moment in which the Jews find themselves literally, metaphorically, between a rock and a hard place. The sea in front of them, which basically reflects, certain death. And behind them is Pharaoh and his army, reflecting, violence and further enslavement in Egypt. Now, what Ibn Ezra notes at this moment is, if you remember in the context of the story, how do the Jews respond at this moment? Right? The Jews respond, like I said before, what do they do? What do Jews do when things get rough? When things get really bad, they turn to their leaders and they say, well, in this case, what they say is, Moshe, did you have to take us out of Egypt into the desert? Were there not enough graves in Egypt to bury us in? Right? The idea being basically, Moshe, this is all your fault. You brought us out here to die. And what Ibn Ezra notes is, well, okay, right? Things look bad, but we're missing something here. How many Jews left Egypt? Does anybody remember? What's the famous number? All right, I think I saw somebody mouth. 600,000, right? Right. So here's the thing. That's only the men. It doesn't actually include the census for women and children. So in theory, there were like a 1.5 million, if not more, Jews basically there. And what Ibn Ezra notes, he says as follows: he says, one can question how it is possible that a great encampment of 600,000 people would fear those pursuing them, right? So here's the thing: however big Pharaoh's army is, it's not 600,000. Like you don't field an army of 600,000 anytime, any place. So the Jews vastly outnumber Pharaoh's army. So theoretically, even though there's risk in fighting Pharaoh, when they outnumber him by such great numbers, the Jews should say to themselves, we're going to fight, right? Because we will know that we'll beat him. We're so much more than them in the end. And that's what Ibn Ezra says. Why would they not fight for themselves? Fight for their children, he says, right? They're sitting there with their children at the Dead Sea. You're going to drag your children back into slavery? What kind of parents are you? The answer, here's what Ibn Ezra says. Why did the Jews fight? Why were they so afraid? Because Egyptians were the masters of Israel, right? Jews were slaves, Egyptians were the master. And if there's one thing the slave knows is you don't strike down the master, right? That is going to end very, very badly. And Ibn Ezra continues, he says, and the generation which had left Egypt learned from their youth to suffer the yoke of Egypt, and its spirit was lowly. How could they now fight against their masters? And Israel was weak and not trained for war. They're weak, they don't know how to fight, and at the end of the day, they're slaves. And this is Paro. This is their master in front of them. There's simply nothing they can do. So this is Ibn Ezra. But what this reflects is the same concerns that Hegel has, is that, again, the Jews don't ever seem willing to fight for their freedom. They just don't. Now, we've talked a bit about why this is in the sense of slavery in Egypt. And what I want to just highlight again briefly is that what makes slavery in Egypt so pernicious for the Jews is that they were not a people that even had like a memory of their freedom, right? This was a people who had been enslaved for generations, and their mind just like didn't exist, right? Moshe is an anomaly for them, right? In their time, right, to be a Jew in Egypt meant to be a slave. And what that meant is that they could not imagine the possibility of being free. And if you cannot imagine the possibility of being free, then how would you even know what it means to act free, right? To fight for your freedom. I'm not going to read it here, but again, the famous description of Egypt is that it's a Beit Avadim. It is a house of bondage, right? It is a society in which, on a certain level, as we saw last week, everybody, Jew and Egyptian alike, are enslaved to Paro. It is not a place in which people can imagine freedom. And so therefore, it shouldn't surprise us that even as the Jews are being given opportunities, they don't necessarily seem to take it up, right? I'll just note here that the experience of domination, really a psychological domination, is inherent to any kind of slave society, right? In the American South, before the Civil War, there were regions like counties in which the percentage of black slaves to white slave owners was like 4 or 5 to 1, right? The whites were vastly outnumbered by their black slaves. Yet, even in those places, the black slaves did not necessarily take up arms and rebel, right? Because there's something about the domination of slavery that is not just physical, but ultimately psychological as well. And as Ibn Ezra says here, right, the Jews didn't strike down the Egyptians because they were the masters of Israel. And the real question here is, again, what does it mean not just to be physically free, but what does it mean to be psychologically free from those things that those structures of oppression that enslave us? And what I want to note here for Hegel, the real issue here, and this is where he writes in Phenomenology of Spirit, that his concern about freedom is that you cannot be free if you're not willing to risk your life, right? He says here, and this is just a very brief quote from a very long book, but what he says is, and it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Freedom means a willingness to risk your life, because if you're not willing to risk your life, then you are still enslaved to your own sort of like self-interest, to your own like individual needs. It's only when you're willing to risk your life that you show that you're not enslaved by anything. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. You can only be you as an independent subject if you're willing to basically sacrifice everything, right? That's how you show your freedom, right? That you are willing to say no, to stand against, to act out, to give up everything, right? That is how you show that you are free for Hegel. So the question is there anywhere in the story that we can, see that we can find that? And the truth is, on the Pshat level, no. Hegel is very much white. But to that end, we're going to turn to the midrash, which does see a particular moment in the narrative as being the moment in which the Jews do fight for their freedom in a very visceral way. What I'll also note here, and this is, I think, something very important about the Exodus story, is that normally, when it comes to the question of emancipation or liberation, how does the slave become free? I mean, I mentioned this a little bit before, right? The quintessentially, in our fantasies, right? The slave becomes free when the slave kills the master, when the slave strikes down the master, right? That is the moment when the slave becomes free. Now, the problem, and that's true of many movies, right? There's a movie Quentin Tarantino made several years ago called Django Unchained, right? Which is a movie about slave revolt and liberation. It's a fantasy of it in the American South. And again, like the whole climax of the movie is like the killing of the evil master, right? Like that is the moment. It's both an act of revenge and it's an act of emancipation. The problem with most acts of revolution, particularly when the violence is directed at the master, right, the bad guy who's responsible for everything, is that usually when the slave, when the revolutionary takes over, what you find is that the society that ultimately is formed doesn't look that dramatically different than the oppressive society that preceded it. Right? This is a point we saw in Rav Tamarat. He makes this very explicitly, that when you look at revolution, particularly in Europe, right? He talks about nationalist revolutions here. He says that even though there's an attempt to take over and build something new, right? When it's often perpetrated by violence and violence directed at the old masters, it usually just ends by creating new masters, right? He says here, he says the strategies of these revolutions, the answering of evil, with violence, right? One of the assumptions is revolution, emancipation requires violence, and it requires violence against those that are manning the systems of oppression, right? He says it may succeed, but on the other hand, it is just as likely to aggravate the original evil. And even when it does succeed, it is only a short-lived palliative. It doesn't really work for that long. This we have seen clearly in every land where freedom was seized forcibly by nationalist revolutions. In no time at all, the plague of despotism erupted in the flesh of the body politic, just as before. Right? Nationalism was a revolutionary force in the 19th century in Europe, and it was intended to be a liberatory force, right? To help bring rights to the people, right? From their either aristocratic or monarchical, leaders. But the truth is, the societies that were often formed through those revolutions could be just as much, despotic as the, monarchies that preceded them, right? The French Revolution is the classic example. From the French Revolution in 1789 until the rise of Napoleon as emperor, how many years is that? I don't know, 10 years, 15 years? It's almost nothing, right? It doesn't take long before the great fight for freedom becomes, despotism. And that is the challenge always with revolution. And what I want to argue here, in part, is that part of why that happens is when it is when revolution is fueled by the fantasy that freedom is about rising up and striking down the master. That when you think about it that way, it really reflects a fantasy in which the slave or the oppressed person just wants to replace the master. If you think you can strike down the master and be free, then it's really often just about replacing the master. For me, the classic example of this is what always drilled it in my head from the time I was young. I remember reading this in 6th grade, George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? It's a parable about the Russian Revolution, and particularly about the rise of Stalinism. And I will never forget the end of the book. It always stayed with me. I haven't even looked at it in years, but I wanted to pull it out for this class. If you're familiar with the narrative, right? It's a parable for the rise of, communism. The animals basically take over the farm from their oppressive human overlords. It's supposed to be a collective effort. It's supposed to be like a socialist effort. Everybody's going to work in, everybody's going to receive equally. They're no longer going to be oppressed. They're no longer going to be treated as animals, right, on a certain level. And there's a competition among some of the pigs, right? Who's going to take over? Snowball, Napoleon. Napoleon ends up taking over. Obviously, the metaphor is right on the nose there. And Napoleon is the Stalinist figure. And he takes over the farm and he runs it under the guise of like their socialist values, their values of equality. But at the very end, it's also clear that Napoleon's rise to power in the story has been like as a dictator, essentially. He's killing his rivals, he's driving away his rivals, he's using violence, he's lying about it, but that's how he's rising to power. And at the very end of the narrative, we see that Napoleon the pig is in the farm and he's hanging out with a bunch of human beings. And the final line of the book, Orwell writes, it says, 12 voices were shouting in anger and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. Right at the table, there's a bunch of pigs and humans playing cards and having fun. He says, the creatures outside looked from man to pig to man. The animals on the farm are actually looking in the window as this is happening. From man to pig to man, but already it was impossible to say which is which. right? The animals rise up, they kill their masters, they drive away the human beings, and they take over. But what happens to the pigs? They basically become the human farm, oppressors, right? And that is often the story of revolution. And the question becomes then, how does that not happen? And I think at a certain level, the Exodus is pointing to that. First and foremost, because the violence in the Exodus is not being perpetrated by the Jews, at least the violence on the Egyptians, right? The violence on the Egyptians is being perpetrated by God. And I think that's important because, again, when you rise up and engage in violence against your oppressors, right, it is often or always going to be mixed with desires for revenge that make that violence hardly emancipatory. More importantly, I do think there is violence that is necessary in revolution. But as Tad McGowan says here, he's been our theorist we've seen a few times. The violence of revolution is not so much that it needs to be directed at the master. It's a violence to a certain extent that needs to be directed at ourselves. It needs to be directed at ourselves in the sense that we have internalized the values, the identity of the oppressor, and we have to sever ourselves from that to allow for the possibility of real freedom. And that is not easy, right? The great revolutionary act is not striking down the master. It's internally striking at that which in yourself, which chains you to the master, which chains you to the ideology, the worldview, the society, the structures of oppression that the master has set up and that you've existed in. So I want to just read the quote here because I think it's a good one about what we think about emancipation, how the Torah thinks about it, as we'll see. Violence is first and foremost a violence performed on oneself, revolutionary violence. Freedom depends not so much on violently breaking the external chains that hold us, but on shattering our own investments in the psychic chains that hold us far more strongly. This is the act that enables us to break the external chains, which is why the political act strikes first at oneself rather than one's political opponents. If you haven't emancipated yourself, then any violence you use externally in the act of emancipation is ultimately going to be counterproductive. And the challenge is, of course, is that it's a lot easier to kill the master than it is to sever yourself or cut yourself off from that which connects you to the master. Much, much, much harder, right? Violence is easy. External violence is always easy, right? Internal violence, how we let go of those things that dominate us, it's infinitely harder. But it's the true challenge of liberation, always. I want to show you how the rabbis think through this idea. So where is this act of liberation? Where are the Jews finally fighting for their freedom? And for Chazal, for the rabbis, they see it in the act of the Korban Pesach. If you remember, on the 10th of Nisan, Moshe tells the people they've got to take in the Korban Pesach, their goats, or their lambs, and they're going to keep them in their homes for 4 days. And then on the 14th of Nisan, they're going to slaughter the goat, right? They're going to spread the blood on the doorposts, and they're going to eat the goat, right? As basically the first Seder. And then following that, they're going to leave Egypt and go free. And what's very interesting is the rabbis recognize that the taking and the slaughtering of the goat is a radical act for the Jews. It's a radical act because it means doing exactly what Hegel said they need to do. It means they're going to be risking their lives, and also what McGowan said, and that they're going to also have to try to separate themselves from that which enslaves them on a psychic level. So if you're familiar with the narrative, right, part of the reason this act of the Korban Pesach is such a big deal, right? Why is it such a radical act? Because Moshe already told Paro earlier on that if the Jews want to worship the God, they have to leave Egypt. They can't do it in Egypt. Why is this? Because for the Jews to worship their God, they're going to have to offer sacrifices. They're going to have to kill things like lambs and goats. And from the Egyptian perspective, lambs and goats are holy objects. They're symbolic of their gods. And if the Jews were to kill lambs and goats in Egypt, right, it would be this great act of blasphemy to the Egyptians. The Jews would literally be striking down these images of the Egyptian gods. So that's why the Jews can't worship God in Egypt. But at the end of the day, they're going to worship God in Egypt, right? They're going to take the lamb and they're the Egyptian lamb, the Egyptian god, and they're going to slaughter it. And in fact, when Moshe first raises this with Paro, he says, we can't worship our God in Egypt. We can't slaughter our lamb in Egypt, because he says to Paro, if we do this, you're going to kill us, right? The Jews know if they take that lamb in front of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians know what they're going to do with it, and the Egyptians see them slaughtering it, it's as if the Jews are signing their own death warrant. So the act of slaughtering the corpse, this is on the pshat level even, right? That's not even the midrash, right? But on the level of the midrash, the rabbis understand that for the Jews to do this, it requires a radical sacrifice on their part, on a deep individual level. So let me read you. Right, the first one, Shemot Rabbah, draw out and take your lambs. That's the language Moshe uses. When the Holy One, blessed be He, told Moses to slay the paschal lamb, to kill the Korban Pesach, Moses answered, Lord of the universe, how can I possibly do this thing? Do you not know that the lamb is the Egyptian god? As it says, if we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? God replied, as thou lives, Israel will not depart from here before they slaughter the Egyptian gods before their very eyes, that I may teach them that their gods are really nothing at all. So what Moshe is saying to God in this imagined conversation is, again, how can I tell the Jews to slaughter the lamb, to kill the lamb, right? It's going to enrage the Egyptians. The Jews are going to be killing the Egyptians' gods, right? How can we possibly do this? And God says to Moshe, you can't leave Egypt until the Jews show to the Egyptians that their gods are nothing, right? So what's interesting is you could imagine a revolution. Unfortunately, this is what usually happens in revolutions, in which the slave rises up, and again, their job is to kill the master, right? That's what we said. That's the fantasy. What God is telling Moshe is that for the Jews to become emancipated, it's not their job to kill the master. It's their job to show the master that what the master thinks is the most important thing in the world is nothing, right? It's just worthless. It's empty, right? It's like dust of the earth. It's meaningless, right? That's the radical act that the Jews need to be willing to do. And doing it is going to require them risking their lives, right? Like that is the risk. That is what's necessary as a way of showing their freedom, right? This act of defiance to the Egyptian, saying to the Egyptian, that which you think is the most important thing in the world is absolutely nothing at all, right? That's one angle on this revolutionary act. The second angle is even more radical, right? The first midrash was about what this act of defiance towards the Egyptians. Violence, but not violence at the Egyptian bodies, but at the Egyptian social structure, at Egyptian values, and everything that holds their life together, right? I'll just even give you a metaphor for the first example, right? Burning the flag, right? This is like 0.1% of as if the Jews were burning the Egyptian flag. All the Jews together were burning the Egyptian flag, right? They were taking this symbol and showing it means nothing to them, or defecating on it or something like that, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here, this radical act of defiance, showing the Egyptians their values, their gods mean nothing, right? The second approach shines the light back on the Jews themselves, that it's not just a defiance of the Egyptians. The act of slaughtering the Korban Pesach is actually an act of violence directed at the Jews themselves. So here's what the midrash says. It says, you will find that when Israel were in Egypt, they served idols. Right? Here's the deal. Jews have been slaves in Egypt for a long time. They don't know God. They don't have mitzvot. If you're a slave, you take on the religion of your master. That's right. Most African Americans are Christian, right? It's not because they were Christians back in Africa, right? They became Christian through the course of their enslavement. That's what happens to slaves. Again, in many ways, it's the worst aspect about slavery. It's not just that slavery enchains your body. It's that slavery imposes the values of the culture in which you're enslaved to on you, in which you treat them as your own. You treat them as if they are truth with a capital T. And that's what happened to the Jews. They worshiped the Egyptian gods. They worshiped the Egyptian idols. And they didn't want to give them up, because if you worship something as a god, even if it's an oppressive god, right, it becomes so part of you that you are not willing to say goodbye to it. Right? We know this. We know this in our own lives with things that we deeply identify with, but we know are bad for us. Right? How easy do we find it to let them go? Right? The Jews worship the Egyptian gods, and even if they're slaves in Egypt, that is all they know. Right? That is who they are. I said it before. Jews, to be born in Egypt as a Jew is to be born a slave. But nevertheless, God is telling to them, it's not just about getting rid of the Egyptian gods and showing the Egyptian gods their gods are meaningless. They're just a bunch of empty idols. Slaughtering of the Korban Pesach is about the Jews showing to themselves the Egyptian gods are nothing but a bunch of empty idols. Right? That is the challenge. And that is a profound act of sacrifice on the Jews' part. It says here, God continues, they did not every man cast away the detestable things of their eyes. That's a verse from Yechezkel. God said then to Moses, as long as the Jews worship Egyptian gods, they will not be redeemed. Meaning the Jews will not be free unless they let go of the Egyptian gods. Go and tell them to take and abandon their evil ways and to reject idolatry. They got to reject the gods if they're going to go free. This is what is meant by draw out and take your lambs. That is to say, draw away your hands from idolatry and take for yourselves the lambs as the Korban Pesach, thereby slaying the gods of Egypt and preparing for Passover. Only through this will God pass over you. This is the meaning of in sitting still and rest, you shall be slaved. So where is the radical act of emancipation of liberation? It is in the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach, and is an act of defiance against the Egyptians. But more importantly, it is also an act of self-sacrifice on the Jews' parts, because they're not just striking down the Egyptian gods, they are striking down their own gods. And again, when we talk about gods here, we're talking about that which serves as the foundation of our identity, that which serves as the foundation of our worldview, the most important thing in a sense, right? If we try to imagine a parallel today, it would be like somebody coming and basically saying to all the workers at Amazon, right? Like, I am here to help save you. God has sent me to redeem you, to build a society of equality, of fraternity, of solidarity. But here's the thing. It can't happen unless you take all the money you own out of the bank, all of your physical possessions, and you set them all on fire. Right? To a certain extent, that is what God is asking the Jewish people to do by slaughtering the Korban Pesach. Take that which founds sits as the foundation of your identity and your worldview, and I need you to let it go. I need you to let it go if you want to get to the other side, if you want to be free ultimately of it. And that is an act of self-sacrifice that is at the heart of liberation that almost never happens because it's really, really hard. It's a lot easier to kill the master than it is to let go of the master's system that has enslaved you. Because if you kill the master, maybe you get to take the place of the master, right? That is always the fantasy. That is always the danger. So I want to develop this idea a little bit more in the time that we have remaining. That this moment of killing the Korban Pesach as this radical act of emancipation, of psychic emancipation. And to do that, I want to turn back to some secular philosophers, to Immanuel Kant, first and foremost. Immanuel Kant is the greatest of the German philosophers. He precedes Hegel by a few years. Immanuel Kant is also inspired by the French Revolution, but Kant is also a bit scared by the French Revolution because it devolves into the terror, right? And particularly what bothers Kant, ironically, I'm not even sure the terror bothers him as much as when the French people put the king on trial and killed the king. That was a moment that was very horrifying for Kant. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this? Why was putting the king on trial and killing him such a big deal? I mean, he was probably done all these bad things. He was an absolute monarch. He had oppressed his people. Like, he was deserving of it, right? How could they what's the big deal putting the king on trial and killing him? So here's what Kant says. He opens up by saying, I could imagine certain circumstances where it would be legitimate to kill the king. He says the dethronement of a monarch can still be thought of as if he had voluntarily laid aside the crown, right? You could say that, to depose the king has to give the power back to the people. He abdicates his authority, giving it back to the people. Or as if, without any attack on the highest person, he has relinquished his authority and been reduced to the rank of a private person. Right? But you don't have to kill the king, right? When you depose the king can give his power back to the people, right? That's one way revolution could happen, at least in theory. I'm not sure that's ever happened in practice where a tyrant will step down and give his power to the people, but it could happen, right? However, what really bothers Kant, as he says here, he even notes, I could imagine even killing the king. He says, of all the atrocities involved in overthrowing a state by rebellion, the assassination of the monarch is not itself the worst. It's like, I could even imagine the possibility where you have to kill the king or assassinate the king as part of revolution. Because at the end of the day, as he says here, right, the king has an army, the people are trying to rise up, the king can order the army to kill everyone, right? So you could also read it in a certain sense as an act of defense if you're killing the king, right? To preserve the people, right? To ensure that there can be a transition of power without total slaughter. So in that sense, he says it's not an act of punishment. It's an act of, again, trying to rise up and take over in the least bloody way possible that might justify you killing the king. But what is it that Kant found so horrifying? It was when they put the king on trial. So let's read what Kant says about this, because it's a little strange for us. He says the reason for horror at the thought of the formal execution of a monarch by his people is this, right? And for Kant, there's something like stomach turning about them killing the king this way, putting him on trial and killing him. His execution must be regarded as a complete overturning of the principles of the relation between the sovereign and his people. Right? For Kant, as a philosopher, there's a direct relationship between the king and the people. The king is the embodiment and the representative of the people. King is sovereignty. The king is the authority, but is the authority of the people in a sense. You can't have a king without the people. You can't have a people without sovereignty. That sovereign could be a king, that sovereign could be elected representatives, but you need both. If you don't have a king or a sovereign, then you don't really have a people, right? This is even true in Jewish thought. There's a famous line, Ein melech b'li'am. There can be no king without a people. Now that line is in reference to God and the Jewish people, but there's something fundamentally relational about the king and the people that like each one kind of needs the other. And Kant said the king can give the power back to the people, but you can't necessarily have a situation where you could just kill the king. So he says here, he says, a complete overturning of the principles of relation between the sovereign and his people, in which the people, which owes its existence only to the sovereign's. So we left off there. Just we'll finish Immanuel Kant. As I was saying, he finds the French people putting their king on trial and killing him to be so horrific, so aberrant, because of the relationship between the king and the people. Right, the king and his people have sort of an intrinsic dialectical relationship, each one sort of dependent on the other, and therefore, if you can't have one without the other, what does it mean to actually have one kill the other? All right, and he says here, and again, keep in mind, when the king was put on trial, he wasn't just convicted because he had done bad things. At a certain level, he was convicted simply for being the king. Right, his existence was a sin in a sense. Right, his claim to being an absolute monarch, and that act of putting him on trial, finding him guilty, and killing him. I'll just finish here. Kant says. He says that violence of killing him is elevated above the most sacred rights, brazenly and in accordance with principle, like a chasm that irretrievably swallows everything. The execution of a monarch seems to be a crime from which the people cannot be absolved, for it is as if the state commits suicide. Right? When the people kill their king, it's as if the state commits suicide. Now, you don't have to think very hard here to look at the example from before, right? The Jews slaughtering the Korban Pesach, the gods of Egypt, and the French people killing their king, right? There is something about it that is so radical because both of them are acts of suicide. That which had served to fundamentally ground the identity of what it meant to be a Jew in Egypt or what it meant to be a French person in France, you are literally killing them and slaughtering them. And it's as if you're like literally cutting off or killing yourself, right? There's something radical and self sacrificing about it. You cannot be the same afterwards. You're not going to be the same Jew after you slaughter that Korban Pesach. You're not going to be the same French person after you kill the king. This idea is also developed by Slavoj Žižek, who's somebody who draws on German idealism, on Kant in particular. And he talks about the radical act of emancipation in this kind of way. And when I'll read it to you as description, it sounds, I mean, again, every word of this applies to the moments of the Jews having to kill the Korban Pesach in Egypt. He's here talking about the radical act, the act of liberation or emancipation, differs from an active intervention in that it radically transforms its bearer, right? The whole point about the radical act of emancipation is that you are not the same person afterwards, right? That's why it frees you, because it enables you to become something you weren't before. The act is not simply something I accomplish. After an act, I'm literally not the same as before, right? In a certain sense, you can't even say you're the one who did it, because if you're a different person afterwards, then you weren't the person who did it. That's how transformative it is. That's how radical it is. He says, in it, through the act, the subject is annihilated and subsequently reborn. Or not, right? There's always risk. There's no guarantees when you're engaging in revolution. The act involves a kind of temporary eclipse of the subject, which is why every act worthy of this name is mad, right? In the sense of radical accountability, right? To the outsider, the radical act of emancipation, killing the Egyptian gods, right? Killing the king, it looks mad. And to Kant, it looked mad when the French people did this. And I'm sure to the Egyptians, it looked mad when the Jews were doing this. It's not just that it's mad, it's irrational because you're literally destroying that which grounds all the meaning, right? Again, if I tomorrow take all my money out of the bank and put it in a pile and burn it, my kids and my wife are going to think I literally need to be locked up, right? Like they're going to assume there must be something totally wrong with me. He said, Shusha continues, he says, by means of it, I put at stake everything, including myself, my symbolic identity, right? When you kill the king, like I said, you're no longer a French person like you were before. When you slaughter the Korban Pesach, you're no longer an Egyptian slave like you were before. The act is therefore always a crime, a transgression. Remember in Egypt, killing the idol was going to bring the wrath of the Egyptians down upon the Jews, right? There's something about this that is always transgressive, namely of the limit of the symbolic community to which I belong, right? Every revolutionary act is going to be seen as a massive act of like heresy in a sense. The act is defined by this irreducible risk in its most fundamental dimension. It is always negative, an act of annihilation, of wiping out. We not only don't know what will come out of it, its final outcome is ultimately even insignificant, strictly secondary in relation to the no of the pure act. Because there's always a negation involved here, right? To clear a way, to make a space for what might be able to come next. And that is that is the moment of revolution for the Jews in Egypt, in a sense. And part of the way this is captured in the biblical imagination is from a series of verses in the book of Ezekiel, book of Yechezkel. These are verses we actually read at the Seder, so you might sort of caught it in the past. That Yechezkel, one of his metaphors for describing the relationship between God and the Jewish people, is that God came upon the Jewish people when the Jewish people were an infant, a bloody infant. And God basically takes the Jewish people in and raises them as His own. And the famous line that we read in the Haggadah, we also read it at a ceremony of a Brit Milah, is that God tells the infant covered in its blood, "Va'omar lach b'damaya chayi, va'omar lach b'damaya chayi," that in your blood you shall live, in your blood you shall live. Now, the Yechezkel doesn't directly relate this to the Exodus story, but it's pretty clear that's what he's talking about, right? That the act of killing the Korban Pesach, what do the Jews do? They spread the blood on the doorposts, right? So that's the sense of being covered in blood. But even more so, what the metaphor gets at is that the act of the Korban Pesach, that act of leaving Egypt, is an act of birth, right? And as anybody here knows who's either given birth or been at a birth is kind of a violent act, right? What's the sound that you typically hear at a birth? Is it people singing and having a good time? What you hear at a childbirth is often screams and pain, right? There is something violent about birth because it combines, like all revolutionary moments, a sense of life and death, right? And a sense of separation. Birth is only possible when the baby separates from the mother. Right? If the baby doesn't separate from the mother, right, there can't be birth, right? It's something else, unfortunately. And in fact, what is the violent act of birth? Literally the violent act of birth, right? There has to be an act of separation, right? There has to be an act of cutting, right? The cutting of the umbilical cord, right? There has to be that severing if there's going to be the possibility of new life coming into the world, new independent life, right? That can become something else, something new, something that's not its mother, something, that is still yet to be determined. And that radical transformation of birth, of rebirth, of bloody and violent rebirth is what Yechezkel is getting at here with the story of the Korban Pesach and the leaving of Egypt, and it is very much at the heart of what the Jews were doing when they struck down their Egyptian gods, when they engaged in this profound act of defiance to the Egyptians, when they actually ultimately, again, they weren't killing the Egyptians, they were striking down at themselves. But the part of themselves that connected them to the Egyptians, and by striking it down, by clearing it out, it made the possibility for something new, for them to, on some level, be free. Let me stop for a moment here. Um, 1 second. Let me just see if there's any questions. I see Miriam sent one. That quote is from Moshe's son's Brit Milah, not his birth. So, but Demaya Chayi is from Yechezkel. I just don't have it on the screen. Chatan Damim, which is the line that Sipporah uses, is by her son's circumcision, her Moshe's son's circumcision. Again, excuse me. Circumcision in general is part of this sort of bloody revolutionary transformative process that takes place, right? That there should be seen both childbirth and circumcision as part of that same rubric. Excuse me. Any other comments or questions?
My comment was about what you just quoted from Yechezkel. I don't think that that's in every Haggadah.
So
I
one,
think I would.
okay, so I should be clear. But the Maya Chai, I'm almost almost certain is there are also some later verses from that same chapter that are there. The when it talks about the Jewish people as a young woman growing up into physical maturity, that is from this. It's like the next verse here. I just left it off.
Where in the Haggadah does that show up?
Oh, in our Aramia Vedavi,
Not
in the
all
Aramia
Haggadot
Vedavi
are
section.
traditional Haggadot.
What?
Sorry.
Right, but there are some modern Haggadot that use different midrashim than the ones that are
Right. I'm talking about
that
the
you're familiar
classical
with. Let's
for the
just leave it at that.
classical rabbinic Haggadah.
Right,
Right. These
but
verses are cited as part of that.
in Ashkenaz.
Yes.
I posted the poem. You want me to read it, or it's
Yeah,
right
just
there?
I didn't get a chance to see the connection you were making. In the midst of my problems, it flashed off.
Well, that those who create the revolution themselves become the despots, and
Right.
that in this,
Right.
which
That's so Yeats was a conservative, right? And the reason I
yes,
say that
and
is
an
because
anti-Semite. I
right.
found out later.
So the conservative. So what I suggested here was the conservative critique of revolution, right? Which is that don't be a
Right,
revolutionary because
right,
you're just going to
right.
take over. So I'm deeply sympathetic to that critique because I kind of look at history and see that happening. But what the Exodus is really struggling with is what would the alternative to that look like, right? Modernity is still very much struggling with the question of how can we have revolution that can actually make the world a freer, more equal place because we haven't
Right.
quite figured out how to do that yet. What singles out the Exodus story is the way it is attendant to the notion that if you don't emancipate yourselves psychically from that which oppresses you, oftentimes you don't even realize it, right? Because again, the slave doesn't think that they're still oppressed by the master when they kill the master, but that's because they're not realizing the way they have internalized and bought into the the system of the master. And the Torah again, even these are midrashim. We know that they leave Egypt, the Jews, and they're still slaves. They still act as slaves. They still think like slaves because the rabbis are trying to kind of like put this into the story, right? But it is in many ways that the reason this particular shiur is one I'm very drawn to because this is the central challenge of the Torah from the Parshat Shemot on to the end. It's like this question: can the Jews be free? Can the Jews be free and find a way to go to Israel and not recreate Egypt? Right, and that is a challenge that Jews are still struggling with today. It's not just the challenge of thousands of years ago. And that is what, in certain sense, for me, is the fundamental message of the Torah encapsulated within that. So next week we'll look at the question of, again, I was already sort of hinting to it, that many of the halachot relating to this to the Exodus, and particularly this idea of a prohibition not to go back to Egypt, you can't go back to Egypt. What I want to argue, and we'll see next time, is that what it reflects is the Torah's concern that the Jews will go to the land of Israel and recreate Egypt, that they'll appoint a king and that king will become a new Pharaoh. And this is not like a subtext. I think one of the interesting things when you look at the Chumash closely and then some of the Nevi'im, it's actually like pretty explicit. It's just something we, particularly if you're modern Zionists, that we don't want to look too closely at. But I would say in many ways, it's, like I said, a very core message of what the Torah is concerned about. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you everyone who joined us today. As always, thanks also for your patience when we had a few hiccups today.
Thank you.
Always nice
Thank
to
you
have
for your
everyone
patience.
be part of our learning community. And just a reminder that if you want to see other classes that are happening right now, all the classes are listed on our website, drisha.org/classes. You can sign up for the classes and get the registration link on the website. And this was the 4th class, so we have 2 more classes for this interesting class. Okay, thank you so much. Good night, Rabbi Truboff, and later to everyone else.